Hey guys, this is the MMA Breakdown, back with my predictions for UFC on Fox 14. Gustafsson versus Johnson, taking place in Stockholm, Sweden on the 24th. The main card here I think is pretty strong. Fairly excited about this card, more so than I've been for the past few cards. I think the main card here is stronger than that of the upcoming Fight Night Boston McGregor versus Seever card. And check out my predictions for that card, by the way, if you haven't done so. Preliminary card here I think is fairly weak. A lot of European guys making their debuts. A few notable prospects that I'm looking forward to seeing again: Albert Tumenov, Beck Taisumov. But for the most part, just really looking forward to those top three fights on the main card. And because there are a lot of guys making their debut fights here, I'm not going to be giving analysis or making predictions on a lot of the preliminary card fights here. So hopefully we can move through this pretty quickly. But let's get right to it. Starting off with the Fight Pass preliminary card at flyweight, Seery versus Chris Beal. Seery has had 2 fights in the UFC so far. Fought Brad Pickett in his debut. Lost that fight, but I actually thought he put up a pretty good fight. I thought it was more impressive than Brad Pickett. Showed off good hand speed, was beating Pickett to the punch. Seemed like a tough Irish boxer, but couldn't defend against the takedowns of Brad Pickett. Got taken down repeatedly and lost the decision because of that. In his next fight against Phil Harris, who I don't think is a credible opponent at flyweight at all, was able to dominate him. Showed off that good hand speed again. Chris Beal, veteran of Tough 18, didn't impress me much in the house. Lost to eventual winner Chris Holdsworth. And then the UFC got a flying knee knockout in his debut against Patrick Williams. But up to that point, I didn't think he looked impressive at all. His striking seemed very unpolished, was having a hard time landing a lot of his strikes. And then in his next fight, his last fight, lost to Tateki Matsuda. Was really frustrated by the jab of Matsuda. The technical striking, again, seemed unpolished on the feet, but was able to get a few takedowns, was able to explode, had a few flurries, and won the decision there. Beal, I think, his biggest asset, he's explosive, athletic guy, but again, I think he really needs a lot of fine-tuning with his striking. Siri, on the other hand, I think he will have the striking advantage, but I think he's just too one-dimensional to win this fight. I think Beal's going to challenge him with the wrestling, and I think his athleticism and his youthfulness here will win out Beal. I think it's 29, Siri's 35, so kind of a significant age gap there. Beal being the younger, more athletic guy, I think he'll get the win here, and I think he'll do it with the takedowns. Moving on to featherweight, Mirsad Bektic versus Paul Redmond. Redmond making his debut here. Late notice replacement for Alan Omer, and I was looking forward to seeing Omer again. I thought he had a good showing against Jim Ehlers in his debut, even though he lost. Mirsad Bektic, coming off of his debut fight against Chaz Skelly, where he won the fight, looked fairly impressive. I remember him mostly out wrestling and out grappling Skelly, who was the grappler, and has had some good wins since then. So I think that was a strong showing for Bektic. I don't remember much about his striking, but looked like a decent prospect. But without knowing anything about Redmond, can't make a pick here, so we'll have to move on. Fox Sports 1 preliminary card, first fight at heavyweight, Victor Pesta versus Konstantin Erican. Erican making his debut, another guy I don't know anything about. Pesta lost his debut fight against Ruslan Magomedov. Was able to get a few takedowns in that fight from what I remember. I think he got tagged a few times on the feet, though. Might have been dropped, but that's where he struggled, was on the feet. Like I said, got a few takedowns. Other than that, really don't know much about him. And again, Erican making his debut, so can't make a pick here. We'll have to move on. Lightweight, Beck Taisumov versus newcomer Anthony Christodoulou. Beck Taisumov, a lot of hype around this guy when he came in. Fought I think he fought Tai Hyun Bang in his debut. Yeah, won that fight. I didn't think he looked terribly impressive. Looked like a decent average kickboxer. Then his next fight lost to Michel Prazeres. Really struggled with the grappling and the wrestling of Prazeres. Couldn't do much to get up from bottom when he was taken down. Pretty much smothered and controlled that whole fight. But then in his last fight, rebounded in a big way against Marcin Bandel. Got a big knockout in the first round. Looked like he had vastly improved his striking. Looked a lot more comfortable and fluid on the feet. Showed big power. Seems to be a very lethal striker now. So I think he's improving, getting better. But again, Christodoulou, newcomer, can't make a pick. But this is one where I would expect Taisumov to perform well and look good. I think he's really dangerous on the feet from what we saw in his last fight, but not going to make a pick. Now moving on to light heavyweight, Nikita Krylov versus Stanislav Nedkov. To me, this is kind of an interesting matchup. You have Nikita Krylov, kind of a young up-and-comer, real young, only 22, has had a few finishes in his last fights, his last couple of fights. And then Stanislav Nedkov, who hasn't fought in 2 years. His last fight was a loss. TKO lost to Tom Watson in February of 2013, so nearly a 2-year layoff for him. Before that loss to Tom Watson, he got submitted by Thiago Silva, which was overturned to a no contest. And before that, in his debut, which was 4 years ago almost, beat Louise Kane by knockout in the first round. Remember that fight? Was in trouble early in that fight, but came back to knock out Kane. Against Tom Watson, I think he had his moments too. Krylov, though, on one hand, he's had a couple of impressive finishes. Took out Walt Harris with a head kick in the first round. And then in his last fight was able to finish Cody Donovan in the first round as well, although that took a little bit longer. He ate a lot of shots in that fight. But then he's just had, against Ovince St. Preux, lost by Von Flue choke, which means he played a part in choking himself out. Seemed to be, really showed how green and unintelligent of a fighter he is in that fight. And then against Paleli in his debut, that was at heavyweight, gassed terribly, had his moments on the ground and on the feet, but eventually got knocked out. So kind of an inconsistent fighter is Nikita Krylov. Nedkov, I think, has a chance to catch him with the power, but I think that's about it. And I can't really ignore that 2-year layoff. Krylov's been competing more regularly and pushes a good pace. So kind of an even fight, I think. I'm going to go with Krylov just because of the 2-year layoff for Nedkov. But, as aggressive and as green as Krylov is, I think he's going to leave an opening on that feet. Donovan was able to get in a lot of shots on him before Krylov eventually knocked him out. So I think there will be that opening for Nedkov. But I'm going to take Krylov here, but I think it could be even. Next fight up at featherweight, Andy Ogle versus another newcomer, Makwan Amirkhani. Andy Ogle, veteran of Tough 15, the Tough Live season. And since coming into the UFC, has really struggled to get the wins, but has competed very well against higher level competition. Performed well against guys that I thought he should have just laid down to, and guys who should have really ran over him. Got the win, or in his UFC debut, lost to Akira Corassani. I thought his striking looked solid in that fight. Was able to tag Corassani a few times and drop him. Then got the win over Josh Grisby. And then against Cole Miller, I thought he lost the first 2 rounds, but in the third round came on strong. Was able to get top position on Cole Miller and pound on him. And against Charles Oliveira, was able to get a few takedowns again, spend some time in top position. And then against Maximo Blanco, got hurt early in that first round. I think it was a crane kick that Blanco hit him with, but was able to recover again. I think he was doing well on the ground in that fight, and I thought going in the third round it was even, but Blanco was able to win that third round. But he has big heart. He's really scrappy, kind of undersized, I think, for the weight class, but fights with a lot of heart. And don't know anything about Amir Khani, so can't make a pick here. But yeah, I would just look for Ogle to be able to make it competitive. No one's been able to really run through him. Next up, at welterweight, Kenny Robertson versus Sultan Aliev, another newcomer. Robertson, wasn't so high on him early in his UFC career, but lately, in his last 2 fights, was able to pick up pretty impressive wins. Finished Thiago Perpetuo. I didn't pick him to win that fight. Was able to submit him early in the first round. And then against Ildemar Alcantara, was able to really dominate him with the grappling and wrestling. And Alcantara had just come off of a win against Albert Tumenov, where he out-wrestled him. Looked like a pretty talented wrestler for a Brazilian. And he was also a lot taller than Robertson, I believe. Maybe not. It's 5'11", and Robertson's 5'10". So he wasn't taller than him, but Robertson did look good, really dominated him with the wrestling and grappling. So Robertson, another really scrappy wrestler, grappler, hard-nosed, and if he can establish his takedown game, he's really effective with it. On the feet, doesn't do a whole lot. I think we kind of saw his ceiling against Sean Pearson, a much older fighter at the tail end of his career. Robertson couldn't do much to him, hurt him late in the fight, but for the first 2 rounds was getting beat on the feet. We've seen some submission ability from him, got that knee bar from, I think it was from back mount against Brock Jardine, and then lost to Aaron Simpson in his debut. So I don't know anything about Sultan Aliev. I would definitely not just take Robertson based on his UFC experience. But if he's able to establish that wrestling game, I think he'll be able to win. But again, don't know anything about Aliev, and I don't think Robertson is really a threat on his feet. And moving on, last fight on the Fox Sports 1 preliminary card at welterweight, Nico Musoke versus Albert Tumenov. I'm kind of looking forward to this matchup. 2 guys who've been on small win streaks in the division. Two guys been in the UFC for not too long. Nico Musoke won his last fight against Alexander Yakovlev. Lost to Kelvin Gastelum, but started very strong in that fight. Was able to slam Gastelum, take his back, but couldn't keep that up and got outboxed for the remainder of the fight. Against Viscardi, Andrade got dropped early, but was able to recover and control him on the ground, out-grapple the Brazilian. I thought that was impressive. A strong positional grappler, doesn't really threaten with submissions, but can maintain position. And it got the submission against Alessio Sakara in his debut. But on the feet, we haven't seen too much from Musoke. Not really dangerous there from what we've seen. And Albert Tumenov, on the other hand, blew through Matt Dwyer in his last fight. Looked very good. Looked like a real polished kickboxer. And in his fight before that, knocked out Anthony Lapsley, making short work in almost in an identical looking fight there. Got Lapsley out of there. So it looks like a very dangerous kickboxer. And as we already mentioned in the last fight, lost to Ildemar Alcantara, got out wrestled there. So he might struggle with the grappling here against Musoke, but I don't see Musoke really being able to establish a strong takedown game here. Yeah, I'm going to go with Albert Tumenov. I think it is worth considering that the two guys he's walked through are pretty much bottom of the barrel UFC fighters. Matt Dwyer making his debut in his last fight, and then Anthony Lapsley, who was released, I think, after getting knocked out by him. Nico Musoke in his last fight against Yakovlev was just content to hold him up against the fence, and it was really just a clinch fest the entire fight. I don't see him doing that to Tumenov. I think Tumenov is just too comfortable and fluid on the feet, so I'm going to take Tumenov, but could be a competitive fight. Next up, moving on to the main card on Fox at featherweight, Akira Corassani versus Sam Sicilia. I'm taking Corassani here. Haven't really been a big believer in him. Another tough veteran, is from Tough 14. Lost to Dennis Bermudez in the house, and then coming over to the UFC, won his debut against Ogle, although I thought he lost that fight. And then he's been able to compete with guys who I thought he should have lost to. Got a nice win over Robbie Peralta, showed decent striking there, and then had the DQ win against Maximo Blanco. Can't take anything away from that fight. And then against Poirier, had his moments early, was able to tag Poirier before getting finished in the second round, so was made it more competitive than I would have expected. And then against Max Holloway in his last fight, just got eaten up on the feet, couldn't deal with the combinations or the pace of Holloway. But Sam Sicilia, I think, is just one of the worst fighters in the UFC since he's come over from Tough. He was on Tough 15, the live season, and just a fighter with an extremely limited skill set. He throws almost exclusively haymakers, really wild shots, and can't land them. In his debut, was able to finish fellow Tough castmate Cristiano Marcelo, but then got knocked out by Honey Jason. Against Maximo Blanco, you really saw that, really wild striking game, just throwing a lot of bombs and haymakers, wasn't able to land a lot of them. Had a nice win over Godofredo Pepe. That was the one fight where I thought he really used his wrestling and put all of his skills together, was able to take down Pepe and then just pound him out. Looked terrible against Cole Miller. Got hurt with the jab, got dropped, and then submitted. Against Aaron Phillips, I thought he barely won. That was kind of a really tedious grappling match. Couldn't really hold top position. Got reversed a few times, but won that with the wrestling. And then his last fight against Katsunori Kikuno was not doing well on the feet. I think he got hurt and got submitted on the ground. So I really think Sicilia is very limited with the striking game. Doesn't really mix his wrestling with his striking well at all. And I think Corassani, having proven that he can compete with talented strikers, not so much in his last fight, but Robbie Peralta, who's a power striker, was able to hurt Poirier. I think he's going to hurt Sicilia on the feet here, and Sicilia has been hurt there by Cole Miller and Hani Jason. So I think Corassani's the safe pick here. And moving on to the real relevant fights on the card, light heavyweight Phil Davis versus Ryan Bader. Really looking forward to this matchup. This is a matchup I think has been really years in the making. Two kind of gatekeepers at light heavyweight. Both guys have won some fights but have never really gotten over the hump. And two guys with a pretty similar skill set. I would give the striking edge to Ryan Bader. I thought his win over Rafael Cavalcante showed some of the best striking he's shown in the UFC, and especially mixing his striking with his takedowns. I thought he did that very well in the Cavalcante fight. And then his last fight against Ovince St. Preux, Didn't look so great on the feet. I think St. Preux made him uncomfortable there, but was really able to have his way with the wrestling. I certainly don't think he'll be able to impose his wrestling game that easily against another very talented wrestler like Phil Davis. And Phil Davis, on the other hand, a guy whose striking game I think is just terrible, although he has good footwork and he's able to manage distance. If you think about his fights with Machida and Phil Davis, he's able to come forward. Even in the Phil Davis fight where he was getting outstruck really badly, he was still always moving forward and really pressuring Rumble Johnson. And Johnson, just being a good counter striker, was able to tag him every time he tried to come in. And against Vinny Magalhaes, his hands just look really bad. His striking looks really stiff and awkward. But that forward movement, he's able to do pretty effectively. And against Bader, I think that could make Bader kind of uncomfortable because Bader's the exact opposite of a counter striker like Rumble Johnson. He really lunges forward like he did against Cavalcante. He needs that forward pressure to make his strikes effective and set up his takedowns. And then the wrestling battle, both guys I think have shown pretty similar abilities with their wrestling game. Phil Davis certainly more of a submission threat. I think we might see the return of his submission game here. Has had some creative submissions against Tim Boach and had an anaconda choke on Wagner Prado. But I think this is really just going to come down to Phil Davis being the bigger, stronger, more athletic wrestler than Ryan Bader. If Phil Davis, for some reason, isn't going to be able to establish a takedown, I think he could be in trouble. I think Bader could open up on the feet, possibly hurt him. I see both these guys having deep gas tanks, but Phil Davis, especially after, in his last fight against Teixeira, I thought he was going to lose that fight pretty handily because of how he lost to Rumble Johnson. Teixeira being another dangerous striker, but Davis was able to completely shut down Teixeira's offense with the wrestling. And against a far less dangerous striker like Bader, I think Davis will be able to do the same thing and out-wrestle him here. So I think Phil Davis is going to win a decision, possibly get the submission. I think his just athleticism and his physique is going to win out here. Next up, co-main event middleweight fight between aging legend Dan Henderson and Gegard Mousasi. If this fight was 2 years ago, I'd go with Henderson, but I just can't pick him. He's just so old, and his age really shows. The guy's just not mobile enough to compete at a high level. His movement is really hampered by his age. Seems really shop worn. And for a while there, past couple of years, he was able to do okay against some really elite guys like Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans. He didn't look good in those fights, but wasn't getting hurt or ran over. Both those fights were really razor thin. Both of them pretty uneventful fights. Took down Machida once in that fight, but then against Belfort, I think it was just really evident that his age had just caught up to him. I mean, got destroyed by Belfort early in the first round. As soon as Henderson committed to coming forward, Belfort just countered him, and really hurt him badly. And then his last fight against Shogun, was able to get the knockout there. Was tagged before that point. Was in some trouble. But I think Shogun, that's another case of a guy who's just at the tail end of his career, really physically hindered. Another really shop-worn guy, and I think that's why Henderson was able to get the knockout. But against a younger guy like Mousasi, who uses a lot of forward movement and is going to push a high pace. I was really impressed with Mousasi's win over Mark Munoz. Great forward movement, walking down Munoz and picking him apart with that jab. I thought he looked great. was able to counter the takedown attempts of Munoz and then ended up submitting him. I just don't see Henderson being able to use his wrestling effectively here against Mousasi. And on the feet, I think Mousasi's just too active of a striker, too high volume, and is going to eventually hurt Henderson. So I have to take Mousasi. I think he's going to get the finish. It's going to really have to be a miracle punch from Dan Henderson that's going to win this fight for him, and I just don't see that happening with each fight that passes. Henderson's just getting older, and he seems like he can't really land that shot anymore. He did in his last fight against Hua, and that was off of the break of they're breaking from a scramble, and as Shogun was getting back up, Henderson was able to land that. So I really don't see that here. I think Mousasi is going to get the win and finish Henderson, which is unfortunate because I love Dan Henderson as much as anybody, but I really think he needs to get out of the game. I just don't think it's healthy for him to be competing anymore. He just seems to be taking too much damage. Moving on to the main event, Alexander Gustafsson versus Anthony Johnson. Really fun matchup. I think we're going to get a clear number one contender out of this fight. Two really contrasting styles of striking. I think Alexander Gustafsson is a very talented technical striker. Saw that against John Jones. Great footwork and movement, a really crisp jab. And then Rumble Johnson, much more of a counter striker, but doesn't really use a jab at all. Throws a lot of power shots, powerful combinations, really winds up on his shots, a lot of haymakers. And I thought he countered Phil Davis really well in this fight. I kind of feel like Phil Davis played right into his hands, though. Kept coming forward, even though Johnson was able to really effectively counter him every time. Phil Davis just kept coming forward, and I don't really know how Rumble Johnson's forward pressure is. In this fight, I think if he can close that distance on Gustafsson, he has a chance to hurt him. We saw Gustafsson, I think he was tagged by Jimmy Manuwa a few times before getting the finish there. Against Lil Nog, he was able to run through him in the first round pretty easily. But Lil Nog is so old and shop-worn at that point that I don't know what we could really take away from that fight. I mean, it was an impressive win because Lil Nog hadn't been finished in the UFC before then, and that was a good win for Johnson. But I don't really see Johnson just bum rushing Gustafsson here. And if he does try that, I think Gustafsson can halt his forward movement with the jab and the footwork. So I'm going to take Gustafsson here. I think it goes the distance. If it is a finish, I think it's more likely Johnson gets the finish because of his power. And like I already said, we saw Gustafsson in a little bit of trouble against Manuwa, and Jones also was able to tag him. I don't see this fight really going to the ground. Johnson has shown wrestling rarely in his fights. The most notable fight there being the Belfort fight, was able to get on top of him early, pound on him, give him some trouble there, but I don't see him doing that to Gustafsson. So yeah, I'm going to take Gustafsson here. And one more note I want to make, I think that Gustafsson definitely has the best chance to beat Jones out of anybody, not just based on his first fight, but because he's a technical striker and he's going to try to beat Jones in the technical aspect of the game on the feet. We saw, in his last two fights now, Jones has fought guys who wanted to, close that distance, get inside, and make it dirty. Teixeira and Cormier, they want to play that clinch game, that dirty boxing game, and it hasn't worked out. I think Jones has proved that he's just too strong there. He can play that clinch game. His chin is too good, to go down after eating a couple of uppercuts. And Gustafsson in that first fight, really frustrated him on the feet with the movement and the jab. And I think that's how you have to beat these guys. Anderson Silva, we saw guys like Sonnen, Stephan Bonner, Dan Henderson. A lot of these guys just want to try to bully them, and they think that's the key. But Chris Weidman, he broke down Silva's game, technically found the holes and was able to beat him on the feet from a technical standpoint. And I think that's what Gustafsson brings to Jones. So I'm not saying I'd pick Gustafsson to win that rematch, but I think he certainly is the only guy at light heavyweight who stands a chance to beat Jones because of that. But I do expect him to beat Johnson here. So those are my predictions for UFC on Fox 14, Gustafsson versus Johnson. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Really appreciate it. Check out my picks for McGregor versus Seaver if you haven't done that already. Take care, and I'll be back next week with my predictions for the end of the month pay-per-view, UFC 183, Silva versus Diaz. Take care, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.